Now that users can register with our authentication server, they're going to need a way to log in so that they can get a JWT access token and authenticate across various servers. So to do that, we're going to create a login route on our authentication controller just underneath this register route. So very similar, this is going to be another post request, this time to the login route, and we'll have a function for this action. It's going to be async for an iAction result, and we'll call this login. And just like how we took a register request for registering a new user, we're going to have to get a login request from the body of the HTTP post, and that login request is going to contain the user's credentials. So we haven't created this request yet, so let's go ahead and create that. Let's go into our models request. We are going to add a new item, a class for a login request, and we'll create that. And this is going to be very similar to our register request. So I'm actually going to copy all this and paste it into my login request. Except for logging in, I'm going to have the user only provide a username, so we can get rid of email, and just the password. They don't need to confirm their password. And both of these fields are going to be required. So let's use those data annotations. So pretty straightforward, just a username and password to authenticate. So now back to our controller. We now have our login request. We can get the user's credentials and authenticate them. Now before we do that, I want to do the same thing I did for this register request, where I make sure the model state and those data annotations I have on this request are valid. So we're going to do the same logic. So instead of just copying and pasting all this, I think I'm going to extract this to a method. So let's do that. I'll call this bad request model state. So kind of following the same naming convention that the base controller has for like bad request, conflict. This is a bad request for the model state. And now that we have that method, let me just go ahead and move that to the bottom here. I can do the same thing. So if the model state is invalid, then I'm going to return bad request for the model state. And of course, in that case, that's only going to happen if the user doesn't provide a username and password, which makes sense. But otherwise, we have a username and password, we can try to authenticate the user. So first, we need to make sure that a user exists for the username. So we can get that user using our user repository. So let's just put that into a variable, and we're going to use our user repository and get by username and just pass in the username from our login request. And of course, this is the same method we created last episode for registration, where we wanted to make sure if the username already existed. So we're using that again, but this time we want to make sure the user does exist. So if the user is null from that get by username, we're going to return unauthorized, because obviously the user's credentials are incorrect if there's not even a user created for their username. But otherwise, the username's all good, so next we need to make sure that their password is correct. So part of the login request, we get a password, and we need to compare that to the hashed password, so the password hash, for the existing user. So in order to verify that the login request password and the user's password hash match, we're going to add a method to our password hasher, and this will return a boolean, and we'll call this verify password, and it's going to take the unhashed password and compare it to the password hash, and it'll return true or false if the password does indeed hash into the password hash. So let's implement that in our bcrypt password hasher. This should be pretty straightforward, I'm thinking. I have used bcrypt before, and there is a method, so we can do bcrypt.net.bcrypt, and there's a nice verify method on here where we pass in the unhashed password and then the password hash, and that'll give us back that boolean, true or false, if the passwords match. And now back in our authentication controller, we already have our password hasher injected into this controller, so let's go ahead and use it. So we're going to have a variable here for isCorrectPassword, and that'll represent the result of verifying the login request password against the user's password hash. So if the password is not correct, then we're going to return unauthorized, because the user's credentials are incorrect, they got the wrong password. But if we get past all of this validation and authentication, then we're ready to give the user back an access token. So we are going to have to generate an access token, and I'm actually going to create a service for this. So I'll create a new folder in my services for token generators, and I'm going to have an access token generator. So this is going to generate our JWT access token, and we're going to do that with a method. Give us back a string representing the token, and we'll call this generate token. So let's start creating our token. We're going to have a JWT security token. We'll call that token, and we need to instantiate one of those. Now this doesn't exist. We need to add a package for this. That is system.identitymodel.tokens.jwt. We'll just install the latest version. And now we're ready to initialize our JWT security token. So looking at this constructor, first off, we need an issuer. So this is the address or domain of the server that's issuing the JWT token. So in our case, that is going to be HTTPS, I think just localhost, and I believe the port is 5001. And now we also need an audience. So this is the address or domain of a server that will accept our JWT access token. So I'm just going to have that as localhost. For debugging purposes, this isn't really that important. So I guess I'll just specify the port as 5001. And now we need a list of claims. So let's create a variable up here for our claims. So just a list of claim. So what the heck are these claims? Well, these claims are going to contain information about the user that we're signing this JWT access token for. So we can have a new claim here, and the key for this claim can be ID, and the value can be the ID of the user. So we're going to change this generate token method, and we're going to take in a user. So we can think of this as generating a token for a user. Makes sense. And the value for this ID claim is going to be the user's ID. It needs to be a string, so we'll just call it toString. And we'll also sign the user's email and username into the JWT as well. So we're going to have to update these keys. Instead of just doing these magic strings, it helps to use the predefined claim types. And there's one for email. And using the constants, like this claim types.email, is useful whenever you want to grab this information out of the JWT after you decode it, which we'll see later in this video. So same thing for username, we're just going to sign this with the name key, and that's all the claims that we're going to have. And signing these claims into the token is important because when the user authenticates with another server, that server can decode the JWT, pull out the information in these claims, and then they'll know who the user is, and then maybe they can do some kind of query to get all orders by user ID or by user email or something like that. So let's continue working with our JWT security token. I'm going to clean this up a little bit because we have a lot more things to add to this constructor. So next up we have a date time for not before, and this is when the JWT is going to become valid. So we're going to let ours become valid right when we signed it, so we'll use UTC now. And then after that, we can specify a date time for the expiration time. In my case, I'm going to do 30 minutes from now. Of course, that's kind of short, which might be a problem because we haven't implemented refresh tokens yet. So if this expires in 30 minutes, that means the user is going to have to re-enter their credentials, and that's kind of a bad user experience. So that's why later in the series we're going to have a refresh token so that we can automatically refresh an expired access token without the user having to enter credentials. So since we haven't implemented that, you might want to consider making this a bit longer. But anyways, last but not least, we need our signing credentials. So we're going to have a variable for that. We'll call it credentials, and we'll set that up here. So signing credentials, just going to instantiate signing credentials, and we need a security key, which we haven't created yet, but we'll have a variable for that in just a second. And then we need an algorithm. So we're going to use security algorithms, and we're going to use HMAC SHA-256, so a pretty standard algorithm. And now we're ready to create our security key. So we're going to have a variable for that up here. We call it a key, and we're going to use a symmetric security key. So what that means is that the key that we use to sign our JWT is going to be the same key that we use to verify our JWT as well. So this takes a byte array for our secret key, and to get that we're going to use encoding we'll do UTF-8 and get bytes, and here we can pass in a string that's going to be our secret key. So we're going to have to generate one of those. So I like to use this website to generate my secret keys. I'll leave a link to this below in the description. So I'll just generate, and I'll just grab this first randomly generated key right here, copy that, and just paste that in as my secret value. Now keep in mind, I called this a secret value, and it's not going to be very secret if we're storing it directly in our source code. So for now, we are going to store it right here, but in just a little bit, we're going to move this out, to our appsettings.json, because if it gets stolen, that means anyone can just use that key, sign their own JWTs, and authenticate with any of the servers that expect this key. But for now, we're finally ready to write our JWT. So to do that, we're going to use a JWT security token handler. Just instantiate that and write the token, pass in our JWT security token, and that's going to give us back a string for our access token. So we can just return that from this method. And there we go. We got our JWT. So now we're ready to use that in our authentication controller. So let's have a field for that. Just the access token generator. And we will add that to the constructor. And before we forget, come into our startup.cs and register the access token generator as a singleton so that we can inject it into our controller. And now back in the controller, come on down here. Let's get our access token for this user that we authenticated. So we'll create a variable for that and use our access token generator, generate that token for the user, and now we're ready to send that back from our API. So I could just pass in the access token and send it back as a raw string, but in the future I expect to also generate a refresh token here, and if I want to send back an access token and a refresh token from this method, I'm going to need an object to store both of those. And it's just kind of a good practice to use response objects. So I'm going to create one of those, and this is going to be the authenticated user response. And for now, it's just going to have a single property for our access token. And this response object is what we're going to return from our API. So just instantiate that, set our access token, and there we go. We are ready to test this out, I believe. So I got my API running. I'm back in Postman, and since I don't have a database for this application, I am going to have to register again. There we go, okay. And now I'm going to duplicate this tab and change this to hit my login endpoint that we just created. And update this body. We don't need to send the email to register, and we don't need our confirm password. But there we go, got our username and password correct. Let's log in, and there we go. There's our access token, and it just looks like a bunch of gibberish. So let's go ahead and copy this. And we're going to come over to JWT.io. I'll leave a link for this as well. And we're going to paste that access token into this area. And if we take a look over here, here's all of those claims we added to our JWT. They've been signed into the payload for our token, along with our expiration time, our not before time, the issuer, and the audience as well. So that's great. That means servers can decode all of this information when they authenticate users. But if we take a look down here, it says our signature is invalid. And that's because we're verifying this JWT using just this placeholder secret down here. So what we're going to do is grab our secret right here. So let's copy that. And now back in the debugger, if we paste that secret into here, our signature is now verified. So that means our secret key is indeed symmetric and can be used to sign and verify our JWT. So that said, this secret key is pretty powerful. So like I mentioned before, we don't want to store this in source code. I want to move this to my appsettings.json, and then ideally I wouldn't check this appsettings.json into source control so that no one could steal my secret key. But I'm going to check this in the source code in my case so that you guys can see it. And there's some other things I want to move to the appsettings.json as well, such as the issuer, the audience, and even the expiration minutes as well, so that I don't have to actually change the source code to configure those values, which is also important because I can imagine that development and production are going to have different values. So in our appsettings.json, we're going to have a new key here for authentication, and inside this key we're going to have an object for all of our authentication configuration. So first off, we're going to have our access token secret key. We'll just call that access token secret, and let's grab that from our access token generator. We'll also have access token expiration minutes, so I just want that to be 30 minutes. We need the issuer. That's just going to be HTTPS localhost port 5001, and we'll use the same value for the audience as well. So now we need to load this configuration into our access token generator. So what we're going to do is bind this configuration to a C# object and then pass that C# object to the access token generator. So let's create that object that's going to hold the configuration. We'll put that in our models. We'll call this authentication configuration, and it's going to have properties on here that match the keys and values of this JSON object. So we need a string for the access token secret. We need an integer for the access token expiration minutes, and then we need strings for the issuer and audience. There we go. Let me make sure I spelled those right because the key names do need to match. Looks good. So now let's move into our startup.cs, and now we need to bind that app settings configuration to the C# object. So first, we need a field to access that configuration. So that is an I configuration, and we can get that through the constructor. Gets automatically injected for us. And first, we're going to just instantiate that configuration object. We'll call it authentication configuration. And now the fun part, I can use configuration.bind, and this takes a key. So in our case, it's going to be authentication, and then it takes the object that we want to bind to, so our authentication configuration. So what it's going to do, come into our appsettings.json, it's going to bind the object value, so this, of the authentication key, which we specified right here, authentication. It'll bind all of these values to our authentication configuration object by deserializing this object into our C# object. And once that's done, we can register that configuration as a singleton. And now that it's registered, we can come into our access token generator and inject the configuration in here. We'll just call it configuration, get that injected through the constructor, and then we can rip out all those values from the configuration and pass them in accordingly. So the secret, the issuer, the audience, and last but not least, the token expiration minutes. Perfect. So now our secret is moved into our appsettings.json, which we could exclude from source control and keep secret. And we also have all of these nice configuration values in our app settings as well, so that we can change them as necessary. So there we go. Let's make sure this worked. And there we go. All our values got loaded into the configuration. So I log in, I get the access token, everything still works, but what the heck is the point of this access token? What do I do with it? How can a server use this to authenticate users? Well, let's demonstrate that. So let's add a new project here. We'll do an ASP.core web application. I'll call this dataserver.api, so just a pretty basic name just for the example. We're going to actually use the API template. I don't think that's going to scaffold out too much boilerplate for us, so let's create that. And we can get rid of this weather forecast nonsense. And let's create our own controller. I'll just call this the home controller, I think. So yeah, it's the default name. And instead of returning a view, we're just going to return OK, because this isn't an MVC app, it's an API. And to call this endpoint, you're going to have to authorize. So let's add that authorize attribute, and let's add authentication to this API. So to do that, when we configure services, we're going to add authentication, and we need to specify the default scheme. So we're going to use JWT bearer defaults. I believe we need to install a package for that. There we go. Microsoft.ASP.NET Core authentication JWT bearer. Install the latest package, and we can use the authentication scheme for that. And then we need to add JWT bearer so we can configure that in this callback. And all we need to do is set up token validation parameters. So we're just going to instantiate those, and of course configure that as well. So tons of properties on here, and most importantly, we need to set up our issuer signing key so that we can successfully verify the access token that gets sent to this API to authenticate users. So as we recall, we used a symmetric security key, and we're going to use the same encoding UTF-8 that we used to sign the key, and we're going to get the bytes of, you guessed it, our secret key. So that means our data server is also going to need our access token secret in its own appsettings.json. So really the only way to do that is to copy it. So I am going to copy all of this authentication information, move that over to my other appsettings.json, and this is kind of a hassle because if your secret key ever changes, that means all the servers that use that secret key to validate JWTs are also going to have to update the secret key. So there is a solution to that, and that is Azure Key Vault. So you can store your secret in one spot in that Azure Key Vault, and then all of your servers can reference that key vault and get the secret key. So just like we're going to have a bonus video for setting up a database, we're also going to have a bonus video for setting up Azure Key Vault. So that's going to be exciting. So back in our startup.cs, we need to do that binding again. So I am going to need another configuration object. So I think I'm just going to copy this and use that as a nested class within my startup. We can even make it private, which kind of makes sense because we're not going to be using this configuration outside of the startup class. And I actually don't need the expiration minutes. We can get rid of that and even get rid of it in our appsettings.json as well. But anyways, we need to do that binding again. So I am just going to copy all of that from our authentication server startup. So let's do that. Move that into our data server startup. There we go. So we bind the configuration. This is a property, so let's make that capitalized. And now let's use our access token secret for our symmetric security key. And we also need to specify the issuer, which we have in our configuration as well. And same with the audience, so valid audience. And then we can also tell our token validation parameters to validate the key, the issuer, and the audience whenever they verify a token. So we can use validate issuer signing key, true, validate issuer, and validate audience, all true. And now before I forget, we also have to add authentication middleware. So we can do that with app.useAuthentication, and make sure you do that between use routing and use authorization because order does indeed matter. So I think we're actually ready to test this out. So let me put a breakpoint in my controller that requires authentication, and I'm going to start both of these APIs. So to do that, if you guys aren't sure, you can come to your solution, set startup projects, and you can choose multiple startup projects, and I need to change this to start. So make sure you start both APIs. Let's apply that. Alright, register, log in, get our access token, and let's set up a request to our data server. So this is going to be a GET request, and we'll put in our server address, which I believe is localhost, I'm going to have to check, 44324, and if we send that, we get not found. So I forgot to map this route, so this needs to be an HTTP GET, and we'll just make this the data route. Let's try this again. There we go, make this data, send that request, and there we go, we get unauthorized because we didn't provide our access token. So let's come into our headers, and we are going to add an authorization header and paste in our access token. So let me copy that. Hopefully this hasn't expired yet. So paste that, and we still get unauthorized. And why is that? Well, our authentication scheme is bearer. So that means we need to prefix this token with bearer space, and we'll send this again, and there we go. So we did successfully authenticate with our controller, and we made it into this action, and we'll simply return okay. So authentication worked. So what if you want to get those claims that we signed into the access token, such as the user's ID, email, or username? Well, to do that, we can, for set up a variable, we'll put these in, so the ID, and we can use the HTTP context .user, and here we go, we got a property for claims, and that's going to have all the claims from the decoded JWT. So we can use this helper method, find first value, it's an extension method, and we can pass in the claim type, and that's going to be the key of the claim. So we use the ID, and we'll just copy these lines. We'll get the email and the username as well, and those claim keys were in the claim types class as a constant, so email and name. So that's why it is nice to use these constants to encode and decode your claim values, so that you don't use some kind of magic string and type in the wrong thing or something. But anyways, let's put a breakpoint here and try this all again. Alright, token probably hasn't expired yet. We'll send that, hit our breakpoint. There's the user's ID, the email, and the username. So then this server can do whatever it needs to do with that information, get orders for user with ID, any kind of query like that. And now we can successfully authenticate users. So to sum things up, since we already supported user registration, we added user login. So we authenticate the user, their username and password, and then we generate an access token for them. And we generate that token using a secret key that we have stored safely in a configuration file so no one can steal it. And then we sign some claims into that JWT containing user information such as their ID, email, or name. And then we even demonstrated how we can set up another server that accepts that JWT access token, verifies it is a valid token, and gets information about the authenticated user. But currently, that access token expires in just 30 minutes. And after those 30 minutes, the user's going to have to re-authenticate, and that's going to be a terrible user experience. So that means next, we need to set up refresh tokens so that the user will automatically refresh their access token. So stay tuned for that in the next video. But aside from that, that is where we're going to wrap things up. If you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave them below in the comments section, and leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.